Lesson 2 on our transport and animals, and in this section we're going to look at naming the 4 blood vessels which connect to the heart. So the 2 veins and the 2 arteries which connect to the heart, and we're going to look at the overall structure of the heart. So as a recap from last week, we looked at capillaries. Now we said capillaries are the smallest blood vessel, and their special function is to allow the exchange of materials because they have very thin walls. In fact, the walls of the capillary are only 1 cell thick. So in the diagram flying along here, you can actually see that there's oxygen from the blood leaving and entering the cells, and there's yellow carbon dioxide leaving the cells and entering the blood. The blood arriving from the heart into the capillary is arriving in an artery, because remember arteries go away from the heart, and when it leaves the capillary, so it's going back to the heart, then it's in a vein. And veins have valves to prevent the backflow of blood. Okay, so there's a recap. Because the arteries are going away from the heart to the body, they carry what we call oxygenated blood. So that means it has a high oxygen content. And then when it goes into the capillaries, that allows the molecules required by the cells to diffuse into the cells, and the chemicals that the cells want rid of to diffuse into the blood. So our main one is carbon dioxide from the cells moves into the blood, and then the blood that doesn't have the oxygen, because it's given it to the cells, but now has carbon dioxide instead, we call deoxygenated, and that travels in the veins back to the heart. Okay, so oxygenated from the heart to the body cells, deoxygenated from the body cells back to the heart, and that's the first loop of our circulatory system. So the bottom of this picture so far is what I described there. On the right hand side, from the top of the heart in the red, artery comes out the top of the heart, travels to the bottom of the diagram to the capillaries of the body. This is oxygenated blood. In the capillaries it gives the oxygen to the cells, and it becomes deoxygenated as it receives carbon dioxide instead. So now we've coloured it in blue. So it travels in a vein back to the heart, which is blue, and that's the first loop. The upper loop you can see is the deoxygenated blood goes from the heart to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, becoming oxygenated blood again. So we draw it red again, and it travels back to the heart so it can get pumped around the body and the system can continue. So where does oxygen enter the blood? That's from the alveoli inside the lungs. Which type of blood vessel carries deoxygenated blood to the lungs? Well, it's going to the lungs, that means it must be going away from the heart. And if it's going away from the heart, that must make it an artery. Which type of blood vessel carries oxygenated blood back to the heart? So if it's oxygenated to the heart, then it must be coming from the lungs. It's going to the heart, so it's not an artery, so that makes it a vein. Describe a difference between 2 different types of blood vessel. So you could say the artery has thicker walls than the vein. You could say that a vein has valves, but an artery does not. Okay, so this is what a heart actually looks like on the left. Okay, it's quite complex. If we cut a section away so we can see inside of it, it looks like it does on the right. Now, as it beats, you'll see actually it's like a 2-beat pattern, like a lub-dub, 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 because the top contracts and then the bottom contracts. And if I play this one, you can kind of see that the blood arrives in the top, it then goes down and fills up these 2 large chambers at the bottom, and when they squeeze in, it starts to make that kind of heart shape. When the bottom 2 chambers squeeze, the blood shoots up out the heart from the top and either goes to the lungs or to the body, depending which side it's on. Now what's important right now is you'll see at the top of the screen, the right and left are the wrong way around. Put your hand on your heart right now, so it's on the left side of your body, okay? So take your right hand, place it in the middle of your chest, then slide it to the left. So your thumb should be in the centre, and your fingers should be out to your armpit, okay? That's where your heart is. Now if you take your hand and put it on your screen or on your desk, you'll notice that your thumb's on the left, but when you put it back on your body, that's in the centre. So when we take the heart out and sit it on the table or sit it on the diagram, the left becomes the right and the right becomes the left. Okay, so you always have to make sure that when you see any diagram of the heart, when you look at it, the right side of the diagram is actually the left of the heart, and the right side, the left side of the diagram is the right of the heart. It flips around, okay? So here we can see the 4 chambers of the heart. The 2 chambers at the top are the small ones. We call these the atrium, okay? Our atria is plural. So the right atrium is on the left of the diagram, the left atrium is on the right of the diagram. A good way to remember this is that A for arrival. So remember the blood's arriving in the atria, there at the top. The 2 at the bottom are called ventricles. Now it starts with a V, and remember when you saw the heart squeeze, it makes that kind of heart shape, V shape at the bottom. So remember the 2 big ones at the bottom have the ventricle name. And again, the right ventricle is on the left and the left ventricle is on the right. Now you can see here, the blood enters both atrium at the same time. The blue is the deoxygenated blood coming back from the body. The red is the oxygenated coming back from the lungs. So they both fill up the atrium first of all. The deoxygenated blood is arriving on the right atrium. And again, if you put your hand back on your heart, that makes sense. It's in the centre, okay? The left atrium is out near your armpit. It's closer to the body. That's where the oxygenated blood arrives back from the lungs. They both go down and fill the ventricles below, and when the heart squeezes, it gets sent up and out. The blue deoxygenated blood in the right side of the heart, left of the diagram, is getting sent to the lungs to become oxygenated. The red from the left ventricle is getting sent to the body. You'll notice the left ventricle has a much thicker wall. That's because it has to, when that one squeeze, has to send the blood all the way around the whole body. The right ventricle only needs to squeeze hard enough to send that short distance to the lungs. So we need to know these 4 names. So draw a square on your diagram and just think about A above, V below. Okay? And then remember the right and the left flip and you'll have the names. That's the right atrium, that's the left atrium. That's the right ventricle, that's the left ventricle. So an easy way of doing that to remember. So which chamber pumps blood to the lungs and back to the heart? So if it's going to the lungs, it's deoxygenated blood. Put your hand back on your heart. Which side is closer to your lungs? Is it your fingertips or your thumb? Well, if it's your right hand that you've put on your chest, your thumb should be in the centre, and that is your a good way of thinking about it. Okay? So when the blood comes up and it fills up the right atrium, it then goes into the right ventricle, and that's going to pump it up and to the lungs. And then it'll be back to the heart again, where it arrives in the left atrium. Okay, so this diagram's got both the chambers and the names of the vessels on it. Okay, so let's just, because it's quite a lot, let's start with just the deoxygenated blood. So we're looking at the blue blood on the right side of the heart. So, blood vessel 1, it's arriving to the heart. So that means it's not an artery, it's arriving to the heart. So it's a vein. Now, you can see in the diagram it's called the inferior and superior. You don't need to know that language, but it's useful to remember that it's like 2 veins coming together. So this vein has a 2-word name, and it's called the vena cava. So the vena cava is where the deoxygenated blood arrives at the heart. Okay, it's to the heart, so it's a vein. So that's vena cava. It fills up the right atrium. So remember, your right side of the heart is closer to the lungs, so that's the deoxygenated side, okay, because it's pumping it to the lungs. So right atrium, followed by right ventricle, so A and then V. Now when it leaves, it's going away from the heart to the lungs, that makes it an artery. We call it the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary just means lungs. So whenever the blood vessel is going to the lung, it's going to have pulmonary in its name. If it's going away from the heart, it's the pulmonary artery. So you need to know this pathway. Vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery. When it arrives at the lungs, it becomes oxygenated. So, again, it has to leave the lungs and come back to the heart. If it's going to the heart, it's a vein, not an artery. It's coming from the lungs, so we're going to use that word again, pulmonary. So pulmonary vein, vein tells you it's going to the heart, and pulmonary tells you it's coming from the lungs. Now, it always arrives in the atrium, so this time it's the left atrium, and after the atrium, it's the left ventricle. Now it's going to leave and go to the body, so it's going away from the heart, so this is an artery, and we call that artery the aorta. Okay, so again, that order: pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. There's a good way of remembering it. So if you get any heart question, which you're going to do in the Google form, just think about flipping left and right the wrong way around, and then it's A above V, and then you can name them. Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. On the right side, that is, if you think about your heart's on the left of your body, so the right side is more central. That's the side's job to send the deoxygenated blood to the lungs. That's why I've put it in blue. The red side on the left of the heart is oxygenated, so its job is to pump it to the body. Okay, why do you think there's valves inside in between the chambers of the heart? Well, it's the same reasons why there's valves in the veins. You want to prevent the backflow of blood. When the ventricles squeeze, they want the blood to leave the heart through either the aorta or the pulmonary artery. You don't want the blood to go from the ventricle back into the atria or the atriums. Okay, so it prevents the backflow of blood. Now, there's one important artery. When the blood is oxygenated blood leaves the heart and the aorta, the first branch that comes off the aorta is called the coronary artery. So the aorta is going to carry the blood away from the heart to the body, but the heart itself is made of muscle. So that muscle needs oxygen and glucose. So the first branch of the aorta is the coronary artery, which goes around the heart itself. And that is to give the heart oxygen and glucose so it can continue to beat. Okay, so it's an artery going away from the heart carrying the oxygen and the glucose. And you can see it there highlighted in yellow. So that's a coronary artery. If that gets blocked, you're going to have a heart attack. Okay, now what's causing this is smoking. Okay, now smoking damages the heart. It makes the muscles quite tough. It's harder for the heart to squeeze, and it blocks up the vessels. That means your heart has to work even harder, and it becomes black as it fills with like the tar. Now that can block up the chambers themselves, so the heart has to work harder, which wears the heart out. And again, it can cause blockages in the coronary artery, which is supplying the heart itself with glucose and oxygen. That's why it's important for diet and lifestyle choices to keep the heart healthy. Now, as well as smoking, if you have a fatty diet with high cholesterol, this is actually your blood vessel, okay? Now, that's what it should look like with the blood travelling down the blood vessel. But if you smoke and you have a fatty diet, then the cholesterol builds up in the walls, which makes it thinner and thinner. That makes the pressure higher and higher. A bit like you covering a tap with your thumb, okay? So you're increasing the pressure. Now, that can cause a heart attack or a stroke if it bursts, okay? So if it's an artery in the brain, it can burst and cause a stroke. It's a heart attack if it bursts and causes the coronary artery itself to break. And there's a good diagram of it here, so you can see how tight that is now. It all has to get pushed past that small gap. That's massively increasing the pressure there, okay? So that's why we can talk about high blood pressure being caused by things like smoking or poor diet choices. If that plaque forms and the pressure does build, what can also happen is bits can break off, and that can be like a blood clot that travels around your body and can cause blockages elsewhere, causing like fatalities even. It's important on long plane journeys that you wear special socks or you get up and walk around to stop these kind of blood clots forming in your legs. Now, they can be treated. My grandpa actually had this treatment in his heart. His coronary artery became blocked up, so they put a stent in. And that's when they put something like this in, and it widens and it pushes the blood vessel back open again, and the metal kind of mesh keeps it open, so there's plenty of space for the blood to travel down there, and it stops it from having high blood pressure and stops it from bursting. And this is some diagrams of some stents in action here. Oops. So you can see the mesh is holding it open there, and that allows the blood to travel down the blood vessel. Finally, heart attacks. So what can you do if somebody does have a heart attack? Well, if you know CPR, what you're doing is doing the heart's job for it. You're physically using your hand to the beat of like staying alive to pump up and down and that's pushing the blood around the body. And then you have to pause every so often and pinch the nose and try and blow air down into the lungs, because there's no point putting the blood around the body unless you're getting oxygen that's there to enter the blood. Now, you just have to keep doing that. The heart's not going to restart itself. The heartbeat is actually controlled by an electrical signal from your nerves. So to restart somebody's heart that's stopped, you actually need to attach a device that's going to shock the heart and put an electrical impulse back into, okay? And we call that a defibrillator. They're becoming more common in Scotland. You might see them down the main street in case somebody does have a heart attack. Somebody can give CPR to the person to keep them alive, but you need a defibrillator to arrive to restart the beating of the heart, okay? Again, a stroke, we said, if a blood vessel becomes blocked and it's the blood vessel, the artery is going up to the brain, if that bursts, then you're not going to get oxygen to the brain, so the brain's damaged, and that can cause a stroke. Now, signs of that can be one side of the face is drooping, your arms become weak, speech becomes difficult, then it's time to quickly call an ambulance. Okay, so although we're learning lessons in biology here, these are things that might help save your life or somebody else's life in the future. Okay, let's try some questions to finish. Describe and explain the structural differences between these two types of blood vessel. One on the left's got a vein, the one on the right doesn't. So a valve with the one on the left, making it a vein, the one on the right doesn't, so it must be an artery. So structural differences, the veins have valves, the arteries don't. The vein has a thinner wall than the artery. What's the function of the valves? So you say that they prevent the backflow of blood. Name the chambers. So pause the video, remember to flip your left and rights, see if you can name the chambers. So 1 is on the left, so that's actually the right. It arrives there, so it's the right atrium. Below A becomes V, so that, number 3, is the right ventricle. Number 2 is the left atrium, and number 4 is the left ventricle. Okay, hope you got those right and you're ready to try the Google form below. You can pause here. This is a kind of memory aid to the things that you should know now for the whole topic. We need to know the types of cells, the lymphocytes, the phagocytes, the platelets, and the red blood cells. You need to know the veins, the arteries, and the capillaries. You need to know the arteries have a thicker wall than the veins, and veins have valves, arteries do not, and the valves prevent the backflow of blood. The main organ is our heart, with the atria at the top and the ventricles at the bottom, and remember to flip to the left and rights. Okay, the red blood vessels have a biconcave shape, so they can absorb oxygen more efficiently. They transport oxygen as oxyhemoglobin. The white blood cells, there's two types. Phagocytes carry out phagocytosis by engulfing and digesting pathogens. The lymphocytes actually produce antibodies which destroy specific pathogens. And finally, with the heart, the blood vessel goes around the heart itself to supply it with oxygen and glucose. It's away from the heart, so it's an artery, and it's called the coronary artery. Okay, go and try the questions in the Google form below.